Imagine a teenager finishing a fast-paced, violent video game. Are they actually more likely to act aggressive afterwards, or is this a fear that's been repeated for decades? Even if the evidence doesn't fully support it, today I'm testing the myth. Does playing violent video games make people more aggressive? My big conclusion is that violent video games might cause a temporary, small increase in aggressive thoughts. There's no convincing evidence that they create long-term, real-world aggression. That's my idea I'm going to be walking you through today. Let's start with the first study by Hassan and colleagues in 2013. This was a 3-day lab experiment with 70 college students. They were randomly assigned to play either violent or non-violent video games for 20 minutes a day. Researchers used a very specific operational definition. Violent video games meant the researchers assigned the games. The aggression was measured by a classic noise blast task, which tests how loudly and how longly participants blast an opponent with an unpleasant noise over the 3 days. The violent video games groups showed a small increase in aggressive behavior and hostile expectations. The study conclusion was that violent video games could have a cumulative short-term effect, but there are limitations as it was a small group of only adults over only a 3-day game period with an artificial setting. So this tells us more about temporary lab effects and not so much about real long-term aggression. Now compare that with a much larger and more rigorous study by Pavinsky and Weinstein in 2019. They studied over 1,000 British teenagers and their parents using a pre-registered design. The operational definition were much more closer to real life. Instead of assigning games, researchers measured what teens actually played in their own lives. And instead of having teens report aggression by themselves, their parents rated their behavior, reducing bias. Their findings are very clear. Violent video games were not associated with aggressive behavior at all. Even when they tested non-linear possibilities like whether aggression spiked suddenly after a certain amount of gaming, they still found nothing. So the stronger, more real-world study shows no meaningful relationship. Here's the key comparison. Hassan's study had 70 college students in a short-term experiment with aggression measured artificially in a lab, while Pavinsky and Weinstein had 1,000 plus teenagers using real-world gaming habits and their parents' reported behaviors. Because of the larger and more naturalistic methods, the second study proves much stronger evidence that there's no link between violent video games and real-world aggression. This is the first graph that shows the average hours of students who surveyed, with the most common answer being a range from 0 to 4.3. So this is what I will be basing my analysis off of. This graph shows the average number of gaming hours per week for students based on how often they report yelling when angry while gaming. The x-axis lists the self-reported yelling frequency, and the y-axis shows the average weekly playtime. And it's important here that the bars are relatively close together. There's no strong upwards or downwards trends. This tells students that who yell often don't actually play more hours, and students who don't yell don't play fewer hours. In other words, gaming itself does not appear to drive aggression behavior in our sample. This graph examines yelling frequency during gaming among students. The data shows that most students fall into the sometimes category with 19 responses. The key finding reveals that a surprising inverse relationship. Students who yell more frequently actually play fewer hours per week, while those who yell less tend to game more. This challenges the assumption that increased gaming times drives aggressive behavior. Instead, the data suggests that emotional regulation and even individual temperament, rather than gaming duration itself, is a better prediction of aggressive behavior during gameplay. Short-term lab studies can show tiny temporary changes in aggressive thoughts, but between researchers studying real behavior in the real world. Violent video games do not predict long-term aggression. Violent video games do not make people meaningfully more aggressive over time. Instead, blaming video games, we should focus on other factors that influence aggression, like stress, family environment, and mental health. Thank you for watching.